In the early 1950s, when the Archers was launched, there were two main magazines that were aimed at the farming community, and they were read very widely by farmers across Britain. That's Farmers Weekly and Farmer and Stockbreeder. There were a lot of other titles which were specific to different parts of the industry or had a particular regional focus aimed at farmers in Herefordshire or Hertfordshire or wherever. But Farmer and Stockbreeder and Farmers Weekly had a very wide readership, and I think they did a lot to really give the farming community a sense of identity, a sense of common purpose. As historians, we look at these publications a lot because they really document the concerns of farmers in the period and give us a sense too of kind of common enterprise, common interests, of the sort of things that farmers were lobbying for. And I suppose we particularly tend to focus on the more controversial elements, the outspoken columnists like A.G. Street, offering his rather provocative comments about how farming should be run and what the role of government should be within it. But there's also a myriad of other things that we can learn from these publications about all sorts of aspects of the farming year, farming season, what farmers got up to in terms of social events. And another really important part of these magazines was always an instructional element, that farmers looked at them to find out details about prices, about markets, about different kinds of crops, different technologies that they might want to investigate and use on their own farms. And that instructional element was also a really important part of the BBC's early broadcasts aimed at the farming community. There were talks on farming topics from the 1920s onwards, and often these were aimed very specifically at an agricultural audience with no real interest necessarily in capturing the attention of a town-based audience, but rather to aim them very particularly at the needs of farmers themselves. And so you find that many of these took the form of experts speaking on a particular topic, talking about aspects of technology, aspects of new development within the industry. But you also had the development of a magazine format of programme within which the weather forecast was always one of the really important things that farmers wanted to pick up on. One of the big debates was always about how far you could make these programmes relevant to the farming community across the nation as a whole, when so many regional factors might come into play. And so the BBC began to work on elements of regional broadcasting as well, and focusing programmes particularly at the needs of certain parts of the country. BBC began to move into putting farming on television as well, and in 1957 you saw the launch of a programme called Farming, which had a magazine format and showed opportunities to have a look at farms around the country, to look at specific examples of agriculture in practice, but also had studio discussions on big issues of the day, and of course the weather forecast. And that was scheduled for a Thursday lunchtime, and there was a lot of debate about whether or not this was really the best time to watch, and Farmer and Stockbreeder talked about how many farmers were otherwise engaged at that point in their working day and got their wives to watch instead and then report back to them. But the farming was really an important part of the BBC's schedule, and again that idea that this was a television programme which really was aimed very specifically at a farming audience and not really particularly concerned to capture the interests of an urban audience more generally.
The creation of the Archers needs to be set in the context of what was happening in Britain at the end of the Second World War and the sort of 10, 15 years immediately after it. What you need to remember is that during and at the end of the Second World War, Britain was having a problem in feeding itself. During the war, it's obvious why there's a problem. We were a big food importing country. We were the biggest food importing country in the world, in fact, and we relied for imports on 2/3 of our food, on imports for 2/3 of our food. And clearly, not only were they cut off by U-boat warfare, to some extent cut off by U-boat warfare, but also if you were using ships to bring over food, they couldn't bring over American soldiers, tanks, guns, that kind of thing. So to increase food output during the war was very important. Everyone knows about that. That's a story which has been told many times. What I think is less widely known, but what at the time was equally, if not more important, was that after the war there was also a food production problem, a problem of where we're going to get the food from and who's going to produce it, because the main source of food was in, or one of the main sources of major types of food was in the dollar areas, and after the war we were short of foreign exchange, particularly dollars, and so therefore it became just as important, if not more so, to produce as much as we could from our own resources. So the government put a lot of emphasis onto doing everything that it could to encourage farmers to produce more. They did it partly by giving them higher prices through this very sophisticated mechanism in the 1947 Agriculture Act, and they did it partly by giving farmers information, advice about how to produce more. And that's where broadcasting becomes important. You have the farming program on the radio early in the morning, which will tell farmers, for example, what fat stock prices were in Sturminster Newton the day before. But there's also another kind of information, sort of more technical information, which it's necessary for farmers to have. And some of that they can get from the agricultural press, but we have to remember that radio had a big impetus during the war. Radio, in a sense, brought the nation together. And so when people started to say, how can we get into farmers' minds, how can we get ideas into farmers' minds, they obviously looked at radio. The problem was that wartime radio advice programs were really not very good. They tended to be experts talking in expert language, and they were, well, in terms of an interesting listen, they were a non-starter. And that, I think, is where the Archers begin, because the original producer of the Archers, Godfrey Bazley, was involved in producing some of these post-war agricultural broadcasts, and recognised that he really didn't have very much of. He wasn't getting an audience. He said himself he wasn't getting an audience because the kind of people that he was using weren't very good at it. And then he had an idea about a different kind of radio program, which used a farmer looking over at what other farmers were doing, and that worked quite successfully. But then the presenter he was using went off to do other things. He couldn't find another presenter, and so therefore he came up with this idea. Well, I think a Lincolnshire farmer, Henry Burt, had said, "What we want is a farming Dick Barton," and he Bazley knew the writers of Dick Barton, so he went to them and talked to them about it, and they said, "Well, okay, yes, I think we can produce something along those lines." And so Bazley put in the agricultural content, and they put in the storyline, and it was very much a matter of making it an entertaining story, but with 10% of sort of advice, 15% of information, and the rest being entertainment. And that was the original format, and that was what went out at the beginning of 1951.
When I came into the job, my background had been in agriculture. I did agriculture university. I'd worked on Farmers Weekly as a farming journalist for a number of years. But I'd also worked on the Archers as a scriptwriter. I came into the Archers first as a scriptwriter, and I did that job for about 10 years before I took over as agriculture editor. And then it seemed to me that, you know, with this background knowledge of agriculture, but also a knowledge of how the drama worked, that there's a way perhaps of integrating the agricultural stories, if you like, more closely with the drama. So this is what I tried to do when I came into the job. One of the things that was introduced in my time was the idea that we would take the main farming families and we would have an ongoing storyline for those farming families, which hadn't actually been done before. So it actually kind of embedded the farming stories, if you like, in the overall drama, which hopefully has made it more seamless and also more easily accepted as an integral part of the drama rather than as a technical bolt-on. In practical terms, what I do, or what I did do, is I would produce a set of agricultural notes each month for the script meeting, which is where the storyline starts. These would kind of outline the sort of things that would be going on our Archers farms in the month that we were writing scripts for, which is probably about 3 months ahead. So we'd have a set of notes which would tell the writers exactly what was going to happen on those farms in the coming month. In addition to that, I would read all the scripts and hopefully rewrite any sort of technical, rewrite them for technical accuracy, if you like. But perhaps the most challenging and interesting part of the job was actually coming up with new storylines month by month for the programme. And I did this really by using a lot of my journalistic contacts from my Farmers Weekly days, people I knew in farming, farmers obviously largely, but also people in the wider industry, in, you know, the advisory services, in the technical companies and so on. And I would look at the big issues and the big events that were happening in the real world of farming and think about how these would impact on our particular farming characters. And then, you know, I would put write in storylines that kind of made the general in that sort of big world of farming very particular to our characters, so they could genuinely be their own stories, if you like, their own dramas. One of the first issues I had to confront really was the controversy over GM crops. It was happening at a time when there was a lot of opposition to GM crops, and government was trying to set up trial GM crop plots around the country. And we obviously, very important story, big debate in the real world, so we actually wanted to reflect it in the Archers. So I came up with the idea of having one of our young organic farmers, Tom Archer, going out and trashing a trial GM crop which was being grown by his uncle, Brian Aldridge, which he did with his gang of mates, and they were caught and put up on trial, and they were charged with criminal damage. And at the time we carried that story, there hadn't actually been a case in the courts. It's really interesting that around the time we were doing a story, 2 women who'd done the same thing were put up in the Crown Court in the West Country and charged with criminal damage for damaging a GM crop. On the day the trial opened, the prosecution withdrew the case, and the speculation in the press was the government didn't want these arguments exercised in court. But it was a great opportunity for us, because I was able to go and talk to the defence counsel and find out what the defence case had been, although it had never been tested in this particular circumstance. Also went to the Crown Prosecution Service and talked about their case. So I was able to put those 2 cases together when Tom Archers went to court, and we actually covered the court case all through the week. Because, you know, we're BBC and it had to be fair and unbiased, we gave equal weight to both arguments. And then it was decided higher up whether Tom would be guilty or not guilty. And in fact, we found him not guilty. And the interesting side of it was, a few months later, the head of Greenpeace, who's Lord Melshett, wasn't Lord, he was Peter Melshett at the time, he was charged with criminal damage to a crop. And he used the same defence that we'd previously run in the Archers. And he was found not guilty too. So it was a case of art preceding the real world. So that was because that was such a political and hot issue, it was a good test really, and haven't done anything quite so challenging as that since I started on the Arch as a scriptwriter back in the 1980s. Agriculture has become very politicised, and it's also become very much more mainstream. And now, in the mainstream media, farming stories on a global scale, stories about GM, stories about world food crisis and all the rest of it, are headlines in the main news pages. I think this has made it even more critical that we get the details right. And I think when I started on the Archers, I think the audience was largely content to hear almost gentle stories about life in the countryside and about the husbandry of agriculture, if you like. Very conscious now, today, we have to get the politics right and the global politics of agriculture right. And we actually have had to sit down and discuss as a team, what the approach and the view of our key farmers would be, like Brian Aldrich, who's got farming interests in Eastern Europe, for example. He is very much into this globalised food market. And we've got organic farmers who are obviously much more concerned with local food and local produce. And our audience is very aware of that. They're getting all these messages every day in the newspapers and media and the internet and so on, so we have to get it right. So in a sense, the pressures on getting the technical side and the political side right are greater than they've ever been.
Well, The Archers is really very unusual compared with other soap operas in terms of the audience, because it has a relatively middle class and educated audience, as you would expect from the fact that it's on Radio 4. There's a very high percentage of women in the audience as well, and that obviously is in common with other soap operas. But it means that, for example, the online discussions can develop into quite critical academic debate in a way that perhaps you might not get with another kind of soap opera. And it also means that really there's a desire for the Archers to be a high quality soap opera. If these people are going to be watching soap opera at all, they want it to be perhaps a cut above some of the television soap operas, or at least to have high production values, so that they have in a way a justification for watching soap opera. They don't have to feel embarrassed about listening. They don't have to feel embarrassed about listening to the Archers, because it has this connotation of quality. And that in a way takes the programme into two different directions, which are sometimes in tension. One of which is that the programme has to be, the Archers has to be realistic. So it has to cover modern agriculture, modern and contemporary issues around the countryside and rural life. But at the same time, it has quite a strong nostalgic strand, which is also quite often associated with quality media products. If we think about Downton Abbey, Brideshead Revisited, heritage films, then the Archers is playing a bit also in that arena. And developing this combination of the rural with Englishness and with nostalgia that we see elsewhere in the media. So in the Archers we have at the same time a strong drive in the narrative and drama, and quiet, steady moments when people stop and admire the scenery and comment on the new leaves in spring, or on the beauties of their surroundings, or something very everyday happens, something that isn't a very remarkable event, but it might be a humorous subplot to the story. So it has a slower pace than some other soap operas, and that's associated with this nostalgic Englishness of the programme. And that's also compounded by the fact that a lot of the listeners have been faithful to the programme for a very long time, over many decades. So that in a sense, the programme listening to the programme is a nostalgic experience for them anyway, because it connects to previous phases of their own lives, particularly their childhoods. And many people talk about having memories of listening as a child in the kitchen with domestic life going on around them. So the Archers kind of merges with domesticity and with a feeling of warmth and security. And so it constantly has to balance that sense of pleasure, which is about everydayness and something consoling and rather nostalgic, and dramatic events and realism. So it achieves this balance, but it's quite a complicated negotiation.
Well, what was happening in the early 1950s that created that sort of led to the foundation of the Museum of English Rural Life here at the University of Reading, and the BBC radio serial The Archers, It was really a whole host of things going on at that time. This is post-war Britain, this is Reconstruction Britain, but it's also a nostalgic time. It's a looking back, it's a realisation that things have changed through the course of the war, that the countryside is undergoing a series of dynamic shifts.